This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
You're listening to the 6 o'clock news podcast from BBC Radio 4.
BBC News at 6 o'clock. This is Zep Zones. Good evening. The Olympic Games have opened in Tokyo with a low-key ceremony attended by only a few hundred spectators. The head of the International Olympic Committee said that after the pandemic had forced people apart, this was a moment to cherish. Business leaders have urged ministers to expand their scheme for allowing some workers in England to avoid self-isolation by taking daily COVID tests instead. It's still unclear which sites will be covered by the exemption. Some people who had their 2 coronavirus jabs in different nations of the UK are struggling to get proof they've been double vaccinated. A judge has called for new investigations in the UK and Ireland into whether the security services could have prevented the Omagh bombing in 1998, which killed 29 people. The 2020 Tokyo Olympics have opened, a year later than planned because of the pandemic, with a stripped-back ceremony in a near-empty stadium. With the Japanese capital under its 4th state of emergency, the Games have already faced numerous difficulties. There have not only been health fears but controversies which led to the resignation of several officials. The mood during the ceremony was sombre, with a tribute to those who've died from COVID-19. But the head of the International Olympic Committee suggested the Games could be a symbol of hope and unite people across the world. Our sports correspondent Alex Capstick watched the ceremony.
A burst of fireworks in the colours of indigo and white got the opening ceremony underway in a largely deserted stadium. Fewer than 1,000 VIPs watched an understated show. They might have heard protesters outside calling for the Games to be cancelled. Inside, there were many references to the pandemic, the reason why Tokyo 2020 became the first ever Olympics to be postponed. There was a period of silence in memory of all those who've died. Health workers helped carry Japan's national flag. After a subdued start, the mood lifted with the arrival of the athletes, most of them wearing masks. They marched into a soundtrack of video game theme tunes. COVID restrictions dictated that numbers were reduced. 1,800 drones shimmered in the night sky in the shape of the Games logo and then morphed into planet Earth, hovering above the stadium. It was a standout moment. Children sang John Lennon's Imagine. Famous artists from across the world joined in, representing unity and diversity. The president of the International Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach, recognised the resistance there's been in Japan to these Olympics, but spoke of the unifying power of sport.
You struggled, you persevered, you never gave up, and today you are making your Olympic dream come true.
Emperor Naruhito declared the Games open.
オリンピアードを記念する東京大会の開会を宣言します。
And finally, the climax, the lighting of the Olympic cauldron. The tennis star Naomi Osaka, the face of the Tokyo Olympics, with the closing act of a ceremony very different to previous Olympics. It was quiet, reflective, at times moving. And now, at last, the Games can properly begin.
Team GB were led out by their flag bearers, the sailor Hannah Mills and the rower Mohammed Spihi. Only 22 of the 376-strong team took part. The lower end of the medal expectations are slightly more modest than in previous games. Some events have already begun. Our correspondent Laura Scott looks at what are hoped to be the sporting highlights.
For many of the 11,300 athletes who've made it to Tokyo, just getting there will feel a victory in itself after the stresses and strains of the last year. Over the next 17 days, global megastars and teenage hopefuls will showcase their talents to a remote audience as they vie for Olympic glory. The first medals will be won tomorrow in rifle shooting, and Shona McIntosh will hope to get Britain's campaign off with a bang. The team's chances are difficult to gauge overall. The funding agency UK Sport says the exceptional circumstances have made it impossible to set an exact medal target, so it's instead aiming for between 45 and 70 medals. Double Olympic champion Max Whitlock admits he's feeling the pressure to defend his gymnastics pommel horse title.
I thrive off of challenges, so I've got big targets and big aims, and we all have as a team. We're a very strong team coming out here, so hopefully we can hit our targets, hit our goals, and make sure we keep our nerves at bay.
Sprinter Dina Asher-Smith, swimmer Adam Peaty and cyclists Jason and Laura Kenny are all well-known British stars with big chances, while the fearless 13-year-old skateboarder Sky Brown hopes to do the trick as the youngest ever member of Team GB. Among the international competitors, Japanese tennis star Naomi Osaka will hope to do the hosts proud. And in the men's draw, Novak Djokovic is looking unstoppable, having won all 3 Grand Slams this year. In gymnastics, the American Simone Biles is looking to add to her 4 golds from Rio. Double Olympic 100-metre champion Shelly-Ann Fraser-Price comes into the Games as the fastest woman alive. The 34-year-old sprinter says she's achieved big things. Now she's aiming for great things.
To go to Tokyo with the expectations or the realization that I could walk away with 3 gold medals at an Olympic Games is just mind-blowing.
From the euphoria of medals to the more unexpected sporting stories, the Olympics has always produced moments that captivate the world. It's now time to see what those will be in Tokyo.
Criticism of the government's decision to exempt many key workers in England from self-isolating has intensified, with some industry groups warning that vital sectors will still struggle. Staff at up to 500 sites in the food supply chain will be allowed to take daily tests instead of quarantining. But tonight it's emerged that testing at the first 15 locations won't begin until next week, even though a government minister said this morning the intention was to have them up and running from today. More details from our business correspondent, Darshini David.
After days of lobbying and battling to avoid gaps on shelves, supermarket bosses welcomed the government's announcement that around 10,000 staff in England involved in the manufacture and distribution of food would be exempt from isolating. Staff who've been asked to isolate will be tested daily. Supermarkets submitted a list of priority distribution centres to the government, 15 of which are being chosen as initial testing sites. But the BBC understands these may now not be running until Monday. That raises questions about plans to expand testing to up to 500 sites. And only 10,000 workers will qualify as exempt, a fraction of the 4 million the industry says are involved in supplying food from farm to fork. Richard Walker, who's the managing director of Iceland, said it wasn't a sufficient solution for chains like his.
It's borderline pointless if you're not going to make the entire chain exempt, because at this rate, we'll be able to get food to our shops, but increasingly struggle having staff in our shops to serve customers.
Some businesses remain unsure whether they qualify or how to apply. There are similar concerns too from other sectors, from transport to energy, covered by an alternative scheme. For them, only some vaccinated staff qualify, and named exemptions have to be applied for, a process those running the UK's ports have said is too onerous. Self-isolation requirements are due to be relaxed more widely on August the 16th. There are growing calls across business, including from retailers such as Marks & Spencer, to bring forward that date. The government insists the wider relaxing restrictions could accelerate infection rates. The Environment Secretary, George Eustace, argued the government had taken the right approach.
We're trying to, in doing this, have a proportionate intervention that means the arteries of our food supply chain keep moving, that we can continue to get food onto the supermarket shelves, but not to have an exemption that is so large that it starts to undermine the purpose of what we're doing.
Once again, it's a case of having to balance public health with economic and social well-being. Economists estimate that the so-called pingdemic may have reduced output in the economy by up to 1% this month. Every decision has a cost.
The Doctors' Union, the British Medical Association, has criticised the changes to the isolation rules, warning that exempting healthcare staff was a desperate and potentially unsafe policy. The head of the newly formed UK Health Security Agency, Dr. Jenny Harries, insisted it was still essential for the majority of people to quarantine themselves after receiving an alert from the app.
Self-isolation is a really important component. We know that you're 5 times more likely to become a case yourself if you've been a close contact. And this is the way that we can stop transmission occurring. The important thing is people should obviously get a test, take precautionary action, keep away from other people, use face coverings, and that way we can all stop the transmission.
Rail firms and unions say the plan ministers have come up with to allow some staff to be exempt from isolation while others are not is unworkable. Hundreds of train services were cancelled this week, and several operators are drawing up new timetables for next week as the disruption is expected to continue. Here's our transport correspondent, Caroline Davis.
The number of rail workers being alerted by the COVID app is having a clear impact on services, and some in the industry are warning that it's likely to get worse. One operator, West Midlands Railway, London North Western, cancelled 600 trains last week. It's chosen to cut its London North Western timetable from tomorrow. GWR, Avanti, LNER, Thameslink and Southern will all have reduced timetables next week, although the operator stressed it was difficult to say how many cancellations were due to pinging. Rail unions are also concerned that cancellations could lead to overcrowding. Train operators need to apply to the Department for Transport for an exemption if they want staff who are isolating but who've had 2 jabs to come back to work. One senior railway source called the plan completely unmanageable, saying it would take longer to apply for an exemption than to wait for employees to get out of isolation. The DFT said it recognised the challenges operators were facing. It has agreed that they can consider a reduced or revised timetable in the event of serious shortages. The advice to passengers is check before you travel.
The Scottish Government has confirmed that some essential staff working in critical areas who've had close contact with COVID cases are no longer required to self-isolate. Employees in sectors including health and social care, transport and food supply can now apply for an exemption, allowing them to return to work. The latest survey from the Office for National Statistics estimates that 1.3% of the UK population, or 1 in 80 people, had COVID-19 in the week ending the 17th of July. That's up from 1 in 100 the week before. Our science correspondent Palab Ghosh reports.
Infection levels have continued to rise across the UK in line with what scientists predicted as a result of the increased transmissibility of the Delta variant. It now accounts for nearly every case. The largest rise has been in younger people. It's this group that has the lowest levels of vaccination. The big question is how will the pandemic develop now that more restrictions have been lifted? Scientists simply don't know. That's because there are so many uncertainties at this stage, such as whether people will maintain a degree of social distancing and the effectiveness of vaccination on transmission. And there's concern among researchers, such as Professor Samir Bhatt from Imperial College, that increased case numbers in a country where vaccination levels are high will lead to new variants that are able to infect people that have been immunised.
This is the number one concern in my mind, where you're creating a situation where variants emerge. Right? Variants don't emerge in places like New Zealand, where you've got no infection. They emerge in places of high infection, where there's selection pressures. It's anyone's guess. To be fair, this is the biggest worry.
Public Health England has said that there's a small chance of someone who has had the virus being reinfected with the Delta variant, but that risk is slightly higher than it was with the Alpha variant, which had previously been the dominant form of the virus in the UK. It says that between April and June of this year, 897 Delta infections out of more than 68,000 were possible reinfections.
The latest daily figures show that 36,389 new COVID infections have been reported across the UK. A further 64 people have died within 28 days of a positive test. Due to a technical issue, today's vaccination figures do not include data from Wales. But so far, nearly 46.5 million people have had at least one jab. More than 36.7 million people, nearly 70% of the adult population, are fully immunised. It's emerged that some people who have had their first and second doses of the COVID vaccine in different nations of the UK are struggling to get proof that they've been double vaccinated. It means that, unlike others who have had both doses, those affected will have to isolate if they return from amber list countries. A certificate of proof is already required for international travel. And the Prime Minister has said he plans to make it compulsory for attending large gatherings in England from the end of September. Our political correspondent Helen Catt reports.
It's already recognised that people who've been jabbed abroad can't yet get a COVID pass. Now it's emerged that some people who've had their first and second doses in different nations of the UK are facing difficulties. The BBC has heard from students at universities in Scotland and Wales who've had one of their jabs in England and who can't get their fully vaccinated status recognised in either nation because of problems with sharing records. Julia Benedetta Calabresi, who's taking a PhD at St Andrews, is due to go to her brother's wedding in Zurich next week and has been refused an exemption from quarantine.
I would really love to be there for him. So my plan was originally to fly on Monday evening and coming back on Wednesday morning. But of course, if I have to quarantine upon my return here to Scotland, I can't afford it.
The Scottish Government said it was working at pace to align vaccination records from different nations of the UK and had a process in place for sharing data between England and Scotland. The Welsh Government said it was working with NHS Digital to resolve the issue. Health bodies in England have yet to respond to a request for comment, but in a letter to an MP seen by the BBC, NHS England said that data flows between England and Scotland were now in place but could take a few weeks to filter through.
You're listening to the 6 o'clock news on BBC Radio 4, the main news so far. The Tokyo Olympics have opened with a ceremony in a near-empty stadium. There's growing criticism of the government's plans to allow some key workers in England to take daily COVID tests instead of isolating. Still to come, one small step for Jeff Bezos wasn't enough to earn him his astronaut's wings. A High Court judge has ruled that there should be an investigation into whether the security services could have prevented the Omagh bombing in 1998. 29 people were killed in the attack, which was the worst single atrocity during the Troubles. Relatives of the victims welcomed the judgment and repeated their calls for a full public inquiry. Our Ireland correspondent Chris Page reports.
On a Saturday afternoon in August 1998, a car bomb exploded on the main shopping street in Omagh, in County Tyrone. Warnings had been phoned in to a newsroom and a charity, but the information was wrong, so people were moved towards the explosion instead of away from it. The attack was carried out by the dissident Republican group the Real IRA, which opposed the peace process. The relatives of some of the victims have campaigned for a public inquiry. They claim that intelligence from state agencies, such as the police and MI5, could have been drawn together to stop the bombing. The case at the High Court in Belfast began 8 years ago. The judge has ruled it's plausible that there was a real prospect the attack was preventable and that human rights law required there should be an investigation into the allegations. He also recommended there should be a similar process in the Republic of Ireland because the bomb had been driven across the border. The legal proceedings were brought by Michael Gallagher, whose son Aidan was killed.
For a very long time, there's been no doubt in my mind that Omagh was a preventable atrocity. But nobody wanted to hear that message. Now we have an independent person who has said it, and I think that's hugely relieving. I didn't sleep much last night, but I will sleep much better tonight.
The Northern Ireland Secretary, Brandon Lewis, has said he'll take time to consider the ruling. The judge said it was down to ministers to decide what form the investigation should take. No one's ever been convicted of the Omagh bombing, but now the bereaved families have renewed hope that truths could be revealed.
The widow of the former top civil servant, Lord Hayward, has reacted angrily to criticism of him in a report examining government lobbying. The review, led by Nigel Boardman, concluded that Lord Hayward, who died of cancer in 2018, was primarily responsible for bringing the financier Lex Greensill into Whitehall when he worked as an unpaid advisor while David Cameron was Prime Minister. The review was ordered after it emerged that Mr Cameron had, during the pandemic, lobbied ministers on behalf of Greensill Capital, which collapsed earlier this year. Here's our political correspondent, Jessica Parker.
While acknowledging Lord Hayward could not give his version of events, Nigel Boardman's review pointed to the former Cabinet Secretary as being primarily responsible for bringing the financier Lex Greensill into government. It also concluded that any conflicts of interest should have been considered and that Mr Greensill had at times had an extraordinarily privileged relationship with government. But speaking on the Today programme, Lord Hayward's widow, Lady Hayward, claimed that the process had been a travesty, saying other previous reviews had allowed representation for the deceased.
Uniquely in this situation, Mr Boardman decided not to do that. So he effectively gagged my husband in order to scapegoat him in this process, as far as I can see.
Lady Hayward added that Mr Greensill had been appointed with ministerial authority. The government said that the report did not dispute Lord Hayward's incredible contribution to public life, that the review had been a fair process and that they had listened to Lady Hayward's concerns. While David Cameron's also come in for criticism, the report found he did not breach current lobbying rules and that his actions were not unlawful.
The Wales football manager Ryan Giggs has pleaded not guilty to assaulting his ex-girlfriend and her sister. Appearing at Manchester Crown Court, the 47-year-old also denied a charge of coercive and controlling behaviour towards Kate Greville. The court heard allegations that the former Manchester United player kicked her in the back and threw her out of a hotel room naked. He will go on trial in the new year. The Chinese President Xi Jinping has paid a surprise visit to the politically troubled region of Tibet, the first by a Chinese head of state in more than 30 years. Many exiled Tibetans accuse Beijing of religious repression and of eroding their culture. State media showed footage of President Xi being welcomed, as our China correspondent Stephen McDonnell reports.
Crowds of Tibetans in traditional dress cheered as China's leader walked off the plane and along a wide red carpet. In one of many highly choreographed events, they welcomed Xi Jinping waving Chinese flags. So sensitive was this first visit to the region by a Chinese head of state in 3 decades that state media here didn't report on his arrival until 2 days after it happened, with exile groups claiming that their culture is being eroded by the Communist Party. Any high-level trip to Tibet is controversial. However, tensions with India have made this one even more so. In recent years, deadly clashes between Chinese and Indian soldiers along the Tibetan border have strained relations between the two Asian giants. As a sign of Tibet's strategic importance, Xi Jinping was accompanied there by Zhang Youxia, a senior general in the People's Liberation Army. China's flagship evening news bulletin showed images of Xi Jinping meeting monks and visiting sites said to show increased economic prosperity for Tibetans. The party's strictly controlled media leaves no room for anything but a positive reading of the government's performance in a part of China where all foreigners need special permission to enter.
More than 100 people have died in the western Indian state of Maharashtra in landslides and flooding triggered by torrential monsoon rains. Local officials said they were forced to release water from dams due to days of excessive rains, and that had caused rivers to flood. The Indian military has been helping with the rescue work. Hundreds of villages and towns are without electricity or drinking water. Turkey says it's rescued 37 people who had been aboard a migrant boat which sank overnight off its southwestern coast. The vessel was carrying 45 people. Ankara launched a big search and rescue operation, with Navy ships and aircraft taking part after receiving reports of the accident. The Great Barrier Reef has avoided being listed as an endangered World Heritage Site. The UN's cultural agency, UNESCO, had warned its status could be downgraded, as it has lost half of its corals since 1995, largely due to the impacts of climate change and poor water quality. Australia, which had lobbied against any changes, has been told it must provide a report about conservation efforts next year. The accountancy regulator has criticised the work being carried out by several leading audit firms. The Financial Reporting Council said that in the last financial year, nearly a third of audits required improvement. The annual review by the industry watchdog also singled out one of the big four firms, KPMG, for criticism. Our business reporter, Ramzan Kamali, has more details.
The FRC's annual inspection covered the 7 largest audit firms in the country, and in total 103 audits were reviewed. It found that 29% of those required improvement or significant improvement, only slightly better than last year's 33% figure, Out of the so-called Big Four accountancy firms, KPMG received the worst scores. It is currently awaiting the outcome of an investigation into its audit of the collapsed outsourcer Carillion. The head of audit at KPMG, Kath Burnett, acknowledged the need for improvement, but insisted its bank audits were robust. Grant Thornton, the UK's sixth largest auditor, received the highest marks of the firms which were examined. But its fellow challenger firm, BDO, did not fare so well. More than half of BDO's audits that were inspected fell below the required standard.
In the city, the 100 share index ended the day up 59 points at 7,028. On Wall Street, a short time ago, the Dow Jones was up 197 points at 35,020. On the currency markets, the pound is trading at $1.37.6, and against the euro, sterling is at €1.16.9, and that makes a euro worth 85.5 pence. The competition regulator has warned that the provision of charging points for electric cars in the UK is still inadequate. The Competition and Markets Authority says there are particular problems at motorway service stations, for on-street charging and in rural areas. Here's our energy and environment analyst, Roger Harrabin.
The CMA says charging should be as simple as filling up with petrol or diesel. It says charge points must be easy to find. Charging must be simple and quick to pay for so people don't have to sign up to a provider. The cost of charging must be clear, and all charge points should be able to be used by any type of electric vehicle. It says charging in some places is improving fast, such as shopping centres, workplaces, and people's own garages and driveways. But the industry hasn't taken off in many rural areas where population density is low. Competition between providers at motorway service stations must improve, the authority says, and the rollout of on-street charging by local authorities must be much faster.
The American Major League Baseball team, the Cleveland Indians, are changing their name to the Cleveland Guardians at the end of the season. The Indians name, which they had used since 1915, had long been criticised as insensitive by Native American groups. Last summer, the Washington Redskins of the NFL dropped their name. They are currently known as the Washington Football Team, while they choose a new name. The England winger Jadon Sancho has completed his move to Manchester United from Borussia Dortmund. The £73 million deal makes him the second most expensive English player of all time, behind his new United teammate Harry Maguire. Now, a dramatic tale of survival in the Alaskan wilderness. A man has been rescued after fending off attacks from a grizzly bear for a week. The animal first approached the man in a remote mining camp before dragging him down to a river. Our correspondent Barbara Plett-Usher reports from Washington.
A U.S. Coast Guard helicopter was en route to a mission and had just changed course because of the weather. Then something unusual caught the eye of one of the pilots. A man on the ground was waving with two hands, the international signal of distress. The aircraft landed in the remote wilderness and found the man in a desperate state. He said he'd been attacked by a grizzly bear, which then returned to his camp every night for a week. The man's injuries were not life-threatening, but he hadn't slept in days. He had only 2 rounds of ammunition left in his gun. The door of the old mining shack where he was staying had been ripped off, and there was no way to phone for help. Rescuers said the man appeared to be about 60 years old. He is lucky to have been rescued, but he was very unlucky to have been stalked by a grizzly. They sometimes attack people, but a Coast Guard spokeswoman said it was unusual for a person to have several encounters with the same bear.
In the past 2 weeks, 2 billionaires have successfully travelled to the edge of space on the first commercial flights to carry passengers. The space community has been celebrating a new dawn in space tourism, and both the Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin crews were welcomed back to Earth as astronauts. But it seems they might not all have earned that title, as Sophie Long reports from Los Angeles.
Command engine start. 2, 1.
When Jeff Bezos' New Shepard rocket blasted off from the West Texas desert on Tuesday, it carried in it not just his dreams of moving industry into orbit, but the dreams of others too. 82-year-old Wally Funk had gone through training and testing in the 1960s, but didn't qualify then as an astronaut because she was a woman. Now it seems another hurdle could be in her way. On the same day as Blue Origin's first human spaceflight, the Federal Aviation Administration announced a change to its commercial astronaut wings programme for the first time in 17 years. Previously, one merely had to travel to the recognised boundary with space to receive the coveted wings. But according to the new rules, commercial launch crew members must also demonstrate activities during the flight that are essential to public safety. Sir Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic flight was piloted and all crew members had a job to do. But Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin launch was fully autonomous and those on board simply had to enjoy the ride. So while he and his crew may have made it further into space, they may now not be officially recognised astronauts after all.
The headlines again. Japan's emperor has formally opened the 2020 Olympics in an understated ceremony attended by fewer than 1,000 dignitaries and officials. The head of the International Olympic Committee said that after a pandemic which had forced people apart, this was a moment of hope. Business leaders are pressing for more key workers in England to be exempted from self-isolation if they're pinged by the NHS contact tracing app. Some people who have received their first and second doses of the coronavirus vaccine in different nations in the UK are facing difficulties proving that they're fully jabbed. A judge has called for an investigation into whether the security services could have prevented the Omagh bombing in 1998. BBC News.
For more reports and information, search online for Radio 4 6 o'clock news or use the hashtag Radio46.